So good morning, everybody. My name's Diane Coyle, and I'd like to add my welcome. Thank you, Mike and Peter, for kicking us off. And we're going to pick up that theme of long-term decision-making that Peter mentioned a bit later on. So we're starting with quite a big question, and it's about the role of the state versus the role of the private sector in managing the economy and society more broadly, and whether or not that's shifting, which is a core question for a policy institute. And so I have here with me an economist, a political economist, and a political scientist, which sounds like the start of a great joke, if only I could remember what the punchline was. And I'm not going to read out the biographies because they're in the programme that you have. But I particularly want to thank Professor Andy Westwood from Manchester University for stepping in at the last minute. I also want to mention that Helen and Vicky both have books out. I've got Vicky's here. Helen's is coming out in paperback quite soon, I believe. So do rush out and buy their books later on. So we're going to have the usual panel format where we kick off. I'll put some questions to the panel members. We'll have a bit of a discussion. But we're going to have at least half the time for your participation in the conversation. So I hope you all had enough coffee to start with. So I'm going to start with you, Vicky, if that's all right. And you've experienced work as an economist both in the private sector and the government through your career. You were head of the Government Economic Service in the business department. So can you start us off with this very broad question? How should we think about the roles of government versus the private sector?
Well, I think it's interesting when you compare countries, because, of course, we've become a little bit obsessed recently about the fact that the role of the state has increased in the UK. Taxes have gone up as a share of GDP, which, of course, is something that you would expect to happen anyway, given the ageing population needing to spend a lot more on welfare, health, and all that. But in reality, if you compare countries across, of course, there's COVID and the energy crisis. I'll get to that in a minute. But if you compare countries and look at how they perform, both in terms of overall growth and productivity, if you look at the relative size of the public sector, it doesn't really make any great difference. And it's interesting also listening to Peter Bennett talk about inequality. Because again, if you compare countries and look at the inequality level that exists within each country, again, for most of the period you're looking at, it doesn't actually make very much difference either, I'm afraid. Until you get to the point where, like Paul Krugman has said, this inequality increases social tensions, and you end up with the environment in which companies, private sector, may want to invest in, not looking that attractive, and therefore investment goes somewhere else, and you get into that decline. We may be in danger of getting there ourselves right now. Of course, we've seen investment not doing particularly well for a number of years, particularly since Brexit, but also the financial crisis. But also with strikes and the inequality, if you like, that has arisen post-COVID in terms of who gets any rewards and who doesn't. So, although a lot of that is in the public sector. So the size of the public sector itself doesn't really matter hugely in terms of encouraging perhaps the animal spirits that the private sector should have to create the growth, because the government may be spending money, but it is really the private sector that gets those improvements in productivity with a bit of luck and the growth to continue. But of course, we must also again remember that there are other differences. So you get growth through either an increase in population and the labour force, or through productivity. So in loads of countries, again, in Europe in particular, but also look at Japan, you get an ageing population and decline in population itself, actual decline in population projected. Already we've seen that in a number of countries happening. In the UK, we are in the opposite extreme in the sense that population continues to increase. There's been quite a lot of migration. It continues despite Brexit. But the number of people at work hasn't necessarily gone up because, of course, lots of people have left the labour force. So what you do depend on for the growth is productivity. So the role of the public sector, the government, is to ensure that the conditions are such that this productivity is enhanced. And we were discussing earlier between us in the green room how certainty in the types of policies that the government has, how even the tax regime, which keeps changing, or even whether you're going to be supporting particular sectors with energy prices, which again in the UK we seem to leave to the very last second before we say what's going to happen. And of course, we have been reducing it quite considerably for businesses as of this month by comparison to what happens in other countries. So you tend to affect the willingness of the private sector to invest quite significantly. But of course, you can change that by giving all these capital allowances that have been given. So the role of the public sector is hugely important in setting the conditions that encourage you to invest or not, as the case may be. But if you're thinking about in the abstract, yes, of course, it's true that countries like France have a bigger share of even the production process, which is in state hands, like, for example, for them, whereas we privatize everything, the nuclear industry, the energy sector, and a lot of involvement in loads of other sectors as well. And that is looked at as perhaps a differentiating factor. But if you look just at the UK and look at the FTSE 100, I would suggest that perhaps 80% of all the companies in the FTSE 100 have a reliance on what the public sector does in any case. You know, whether you're talking about the pharmaceutical sector, and look what's been going on with COVID, but also all the regulations that are imposed on them, the prices that are charged for the medicines by NICE, for example. If you look at loads of manufacturing which is linked to the defense sector, it's the government that is involved in procuring all that. If you look even at the banking sector, of course, which is supposed to, the government right now is talking about deregulating, and I hope that, given everything that's happened in the US, that is going to be forgotten. In fact, if anything, you need to regulate it more. So it is regulated, nevertheless, to a very considerable extent. So again, you have the government interference there. And then if you even look at supermarkets or anything else that moves, you have the competition regulators out there. If you look at utilities, they're controlled, or should be better controlled possibly, by the regulators that the government has put in place. So in fact, the entire economy is dependent very significantly on what the public sector does. So this separation of public and private, I think, is completely artificial. And at some stages, of course, it becomes even closer, and at other times you retreat a little bit. But overall, I would think it is a perverse distinction to be making. I think it's all so linked that you can't look at the public sector and say, well, let's leave the private sector alone and let it get on with it, because it doesn't work like that, it hasn't worked like that, and it isn't going to work like that in the future.
So your point about comparing countries and how different they are, and yet many different countries can thrive with different roles for market and state, obviously well taken. But there have been shifts over time, haven't there? So in the 1970s and previously we had a lot of state production in this country, then we had the privatizations. Have your own views changed about that?
Well, I have to admit that in my previous existence, when I was in the private sector, I was very involved in, with the firm I was with, in privatizing quite a large part of the UK economy. It sort of looked good on paper at the time, I have to say. I now think that perhaps it had gone too far, and frankly, we have retreated very considerably. I mean, look at the train companies. Of course, COVID has accelerated that as well, because obviously, the way it was run didn't make a huge amount of sense, and of course, the moment that transport demand went down, they had to be very substantially rescued by the government. But of course, we were still subsidizing the rail industry quite significantly, even when it was in private hands. And then, of course, you look at the utilities right now, what the problems there are. A bank I used to work for, before that, is still partly in state hands, the Royal Bank of Scotland, which is where I started my career. My views are basically that the state needs to be considerably more involved in the areas which are, as we've learned when we did our economics, natural monopolies, and that if you have to split them up or whatever, make them work in a certain way, then at least have the regulators work properly. And we know they are coming under quite a lot of pressure right now. Yes, my views, I mean, I wouldn't say they've necessarily retreated, but I think they have proved what we learned in economics at the end of the day, that you can artificially involve the private sector in various areas, but if you do it in the right way, which still serves the public, and there are still such things as public goods. And so I'm not sure I answered your question, but
I think
let's
you
look.
avoided the question masterfully.
But just look, though, at the last couple of years. If it wasn't for the public sector intervening during COVID, we would be in a terrible state right now. We would have said, goodbye to loads and loads of the companies we know and love if there hadn't been a huge increase in public sector involvement. And of course, Keynesianism came into its own. I think the UK put something like 18 to 20% of its GDP back into the economy through just borrowing, and of course with the help of the central banks. The US, 25%. So we are talking about a much greater involvement once again of the state, and it will be very, very hard for the state to retreat from here.
Well, maybe that's something we'll come back to in the discussion later, but I am quite interested in this idea that economists, in a way, are to blame for some of the mess we find ourselves in by having focused policy too much on efficiency rather than other things that we might care about. But first, next I want to turn to Andy. So we started to touch on whether there's a philosophical shift going on, Andy. Do you think there's a partisan difference? Maybe just focusing on UK politics? Within or between parties, I suppose.
Yeah, well, I think if there is, it's quite hard to tell where, and I think that's particularly relevant when political parties and politicians get into government. They very quickly learn the lesson that all governments are active in some shape or form, and that the decisions that they make are going to shape all sorts of things, not just in the way public services and government is configured, but also in the way that the economy is kind of managed and coordinated, or not managed and not coordinated properly. So I think there is in opposition you can afford to have a little bit more the luxury of kind of idealism and ideology, I guess. But in practice, I think that kind of those partisan differences are much harder to detect. Now, once you've kind of got through that, the questions become not whether governments are more active or not, but how and to what extent. And obviously there are differences there. I mean, I'm also kind of tempted to say that one of the areas of consensus is that over the last sort of 20 or 30 years, that particularly in the UK, that political parties have kind of acted very similarly in the way that they've been unable to coordinate. They've been too keen to chop and change, and that the sort of regimes and interventions have kind of changed with every set of ministers, let alone kind of the political parties that they work to. So I think that creates a particular challenge for the UK, which is this constant political and policy churn, which means that any consensus is kind of quite often lost. But on things like an active state in the economy, I mean, you can, without too much of a stretch, draw a reasonably straight line from kind of the end of the Labour government in 2008, when Vicky and I were working there, and kind of Peter Mandelson's New Industries, New Jobs through the coalition, the industrial strategy that kind of Vince Cable and David Willits kind of authored, even through sort of the kind of post-Brexit Theresa May creation of BEIS and the industrial strategy, and then kind of as that sort of morphed more into regional policy, kind of levelling up and the state being very active there. So you can kind of you can draw that line. I mean, at an ideological level, but at a practical level, there's all sorts of chicanery going on, institutions being chopped and changed, tax regimes being chopped and changed, public markets, regulators being created, chucked away, or being given very different operational sort of tasks and objectives. So I think kind of, the way to sort of sum that up is that there's more consensus, there's more borrowing from each other's ideologies than we might expect to see, but once you're in government, that's often a kind of that's often muddied by kind of what different individuals want to do, what kind of needs to be done, or what they think needs to be done at that particular time, and that adds up to a rather more worrying kind of sense of kind of conformity, if you like, that they're all reverting to, or they're all very often reverting to this kind of UK approach, which is we want an active government, but it's almost too active. It's chopping and changing too frequently, and kind of, nothing stays in place for very long. So, you end up with this kind of borrowing, this constant borrowing and kind of cobbling together of approaches, but that, it's very short-termist and very haphazard.
So it sounds like we've got the worst of all worlds here, that we've got a refusal to acknowledge explicitly that there is this role for the state, but it's hyperactive anyway.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
I think so, and I apologise for bringing us right down to that level straight away in the morning without a sense of kind of, any optimism, but if it does feel that way. We have got the worst of all worlds. We've got kind of consensus about government being active, but real kind of problems of how that role is discharged and what they really want to achieve with it.
Now, I know you've been visiting the US and Germany recently. How do we compare there? What do policymakers there do differently, or how do they think differently?
Well, I think, as I say, I've just spent a month or so in Germany, and of course the great thing that Germany tells us is that stability and long-termism makes a difference. It also tells us that kind of regional policy and capacity also makes a difference. And if you leave things in place for a long period of time, or that you follow certain objectives over a certain period of time, including across quite complex coalitions between the local and the national and different parties at the national level, then you can achieve long-term things. I couldn't help but notice there are less potholes in Germany as they were driving across this morning, but that's just perhaps a very small example. And then in the US, what we're currently seeing is that adoption of not just very active industrial policy through the Inflation Reduction Act and the Chips and Science Act, but very, very active regional policy. I think a big bit that ministers currently in the UK underestimate when they criticise Biden's policy regime is that they miss out that kind of regional element. He's really trying to kind of drive resources, R&D, industrial subsidy, employment support into kind of Rust Belt parts of the US as a response to kind of the political instability and kind of support for Trump, but also as an attempt to kind of, recreate and recast the way the economy works. And I think it's ironic that the UK UK ministers haven't clocked that part of it, especially given that they've been talking about levelling up for so long, that they haven't seen how much of the Inflation Reduction Act and the Chips and Science stuff is focused on place-based policy. And and you look at our approaches to kind of building that kind of infrastructure for the kind of green economy, and it's there at a much smaller scale, but they haven't yet really kind of put the two and two together, the idea that you can do that, but you can also sort of focus some of that infrastructure and capacity in areas, whether you call it the Red Wall or kind of North or the Midlands or whatever, and use that as a way of kind of delivering some of their other objectives. So I think, there are different lessons from both of those countries, but I think the local and regional policy is one aspect of it, and the other is perhaps just that long-term kind of approach to getting these things right.
I think potholes and rubbish collection are not a bad indicator of the capacity of the state.
Oh dear.
So going from the very parochial, Helen, let's broaden it out to, we've not been short of global shocks lately, and you are one of the world experts on global shocks, particularly in energy. Do you think what we've seen in recent years has played a part in shifting views about the role of the state?
Yeah, I'd say that there's something that precedes the energy shocks of the last 2 years in shifting perceptions of what the state can do and indeed needs to do, and that is what happened in China in 2015 with the articulation of the Made in China 2025 strategy. Because I think that showed that the Chinese leadership was utterly committed to using the Chinese state to change China's entire position in the world economy into being not only a high-tech manufacturer, but one in which the rest of the world would in some sense be dependent, at least in part. That instead of China being dependent on the United States, say that the United States was going to be dependent upon China in certain critical supply chains. And we can see that China dominates already the low-carbon energy infrastructure supply chains. And I think that was, particularly for the UK, a big shock, in some ways perhaps comparable to Brexit in the Brexit referendum in 2016, because obviously the policy of the coalition government had really been to cozy up to China as much as possible and to frame that as a kind of like the old sort of interdependence trade and not think about that in geopolitical terms. And I'd suggest that from like 2015 onwards, from Made in China 2025, the world economy just became very geopolitical. And that these questions of what the state can do really play out now in that context, and particularly in terms of the fear that China produces elsewhere, including in Washington. So in that sense, I would kind of see the Inflation Reduction Act as in part a response to Made in China 2025. I think on top of that then, we've seen the recent energy shocks. Now, I think the energy shocks that I would suggest began in the summer of 2021 as the world economy began to recover from COVID have a longer history this century. But I still think we can see that from that point that there have been an acute set of problems, and that they relate on the one side to the problems of the present energy regime that's fossil fuel dominated and will in many ways still be for some time to come. And that what we are seeing there is both that there are supply constraints around oil and gas, at least in terms of affordable prices, and that the supply of energy is heavily geopoliticized itself. That's what we saw as a consequence of Russia's war, both in terms of the way in which NATO countries responded, in terms of energy sanctions, at least in some areas, particularly coal and oil, and in the way in which Russia responded, which was effectively to cut off the supply of gas to Germany starting from last June. And as we know, that has led to a really significant reconfiguration of world energy trade, both on the oil side and particularly on the gas side, because essentially you have Europe's most populous country that had basically no capacity to import seaborne gas before the war started, that now is scrambling around the world trying to find liquid natural gas. And one consequence of that is that some of the poorer Asian countries, I'd say most dramatically and disastrously Pakistan, have found themselves in a terrible economic position. And then we've got the energy transition. And I think that the tension here is that what governments are promising is actually an energy revolution. I mean, essentially, what net zero 2050 means is that within now less than 30 years, we will reinvent the entire energy basis of our material civilization in the world. And that is getting presented as an energy transition. Now, in practice, it will be an energy transition because we will not reinvent the entire material basis of our civilization by 2050. But the tension between what governments are promising that they can do and what they can actually do in practice to accelerate the energy transition, I think, is quite considerable. And then there's a problem about the way in which these different energy issues interact with each other themselves and the way in which they interact with the macroeconomic environment. And I think that what we could see during the course of last year and perhaps last autumn in particular, and Britain in a sense was at the fierce end of this during Liz Truss's short-lived premiership, is that when you have the old energy regime essentially generating inflation for a conjunction of the supply constraint reasons and the war reason, and the central banks have to respond to that or choose to respond to that, however one thinks about that, by raising interest rates. And then that runs into the fact that all the debt that we use to deal with economic problems, including debt problems for a long, long time, and the way in which the financial sector runs off debt means that financial markets can't tolerate very much monetary tightening, is that when governments need to do more, like, say, subsidise energy bills to deal with energy costs is that they have considerable capacity to destabilise financial markets. And although a lot of the attention, for obvious political reasons, got put upon Liz Truss's tax-cutting proposals, actually the big fiscal commitment that she made was this huge energy package, the size of which kind of, I think, got not really noticed because it was announced, as I recall, the same day that the Queen died. But when Jeremy Hunt then wanted to stabilise things or stabilise the markets again with his emergency budget, he made quite big cuts to that energy package. So what we can see is that the financial markets, in the context of a monetary environment, in part, or in good part, driven by energy inflation that the central banks have to respond to, actually makes dealing with the energy problem politically significantly more difficult. And meanwhile, I'd suggest, just the last point I'll make here, that the whole net zero project was conceived in a very different monetary environment in 2019, when the presumption was that you could keep doing QE. And indeed, that year was the year in which the American Federal Reserve, I'd suggest, made its final retreat before the pandemic from any idea that it could get back to monetary normalcy. And so we had QE conceived in this exceptional monetary environment. And now that exceptional monetary environment, it's simultaneously ended, but at the same time, the legacy of it won't go away. So actually, we're now trying to do the energy transition in a financial environment in which the cost of borrowing, the cost of investment are going to be greater. And I think that that is something that policymakers will now have to grapple with.
Just to take this back to my question about the role that economics has played in this, was it a mistake ever to think that energy could be a market like any other market? And so we shaped the structure of the market in the UK and in the EU as if it could be a market in a stable environment. Are we now paying a price for that?
Yes, I think we are. I think that I think this is quite a complicated question. We could spend a lot of time talking about it. But I think one of the really unfortunate consequences of the mantra that markets can deal with energy problems was that it's part of that way in which we started to think in the 90s and the first part of the 2000s that geopolitics could be taken out of the world economy. That I've kind of coming to the view, or the way of seeing it, as that the 70s, very high consciousness amongst policymakers that energy is a resource constraint and that it's a geopolitical problem and that there's any number of geopolitical risks around that. And I think that there's a continuity of that actually goes back through the 20th century. And then, in a way, I think, and this goes back to this idea of like what neoliberalism was actually about, that neoliberalism, I think now, was a kind of reaction against that. That in a way we got used to thinking of it, of saying it was a reaction against Keynesianism. But I think in part, actually, it was a reaction against that whole limits to growth narrative that had taken place in the 70s and say, no, there aren't resource constraints on economic development as long as you trust markets. As long as you trust markets, then supply and demand will align themselves. And I think that the problem where energy was concerned is that did make a certain amount of sense about getting out of the 70s into the 80s. But it made a certain amount of sense because what the higher oil prices, that being deregulative about deregulating American energy controls in particular made possible, was more oil production in parts of the world that weren't geopolitically difficult, i.e. in the United States, in Alaska, in the North Sea, and to some extent offshore Mexico. But once you go back to a world in which that isn't the case, and that where more oil is going to come from might be the Middle East or Russia, and then when you add into that a world in which China and India are much more important energy consumers than they ever were in the 1970s, then it just, I think, becomes a fantasy that markets are going to take care of this problem. And in the interim, whilst that illusion that they could took hold, then I think a lot of policymakers stop thinking about energy as an energy problem, if you see what I mean. It was just another area the way you applied the principle of markets to. And so now we're trying to deal with these problems without as much experience of thinking about them as there was.
I can see Vicky wants to come in on this.
Well, yes, I have to admit that in addition to all the other places I said I worked at, I also worked for the oil industry for a while. And I do remember how the markets were working then. I'm now talking in the 80s, when I was doing scenario planning, we had, we really did look at the markets quite carefully, and we had and we assumed it worked like a market, even though, of course, you had the oil crisis just before, which were politically motivated in a way, because, the Middle East cut a lot of its oil supplies. So it did work that way. Supply and demand did respond. But I remember doing these this forecast scenario planning going a long way ahead, 50 years, which is really what you look at, because you invest in this and you get your returns over a period. And we had the sort of the base scenario. We had the good scenario, the sort of best case scenario. And then we had a catastrophe scenario. Now, the catastrophe scenario at the time was that oil prices would go to below $10 a barrel. But of course, you can't do anything about the catastrophe scenario. You just carry on, pumping the oil out. And of course, we did. Suddenly, oil prices did fall. And the response of the sector was very much market-induced, so which is just cut production, close all your investment stuff, stop bringing things out of the North Sea. They closed the bit I worked at, which was ESSO Europe, and moved it to New Jersey. Fortunately, I had already moved to KPMG by then. But here we had this catastrophe scenario, and of course, look how the markets worked during COVID. So I wouldn't say that the market doesn't work. I remember we had this period of peak oil. Everyone was saying we're going to run out of oil, and therefore we need to look at alternatives. Well, we now know that we're not running out of oil, but of course it is in places that perhaps are a little bit dangerous. But we had oil prices at minus $37 a barrel at the beginning of COVID. I remember July 2020, I think it was. So where you're paying ship owners to put oil in tankers and just keep it there until prices recovered. And of course they did. So, I mean, the only point I would make is that but to your question, is that it has worked as a market. The only thing to bear in mind is, like many other markets, whether it's the pharmaceutical industry or any other, defense, is that it is shaped by the environment around you. And geopolitics matters hugely, but not only for the energy sector, it matters for everything. That's why the role of government is so important. And I think there was a question in your conference stuff that you sent us, which is the sort of global stuff, the extent to which one can influence it. And the real problem with where we are now in the UK is that our influence is a lot less than was the case just a few years ago.
We do give all our panellists homework before they come.
Yes.
So I've got one more question that I want each member of the panel to address, and then I'm going to come to all of you. So get ready, and microphones get ready, please. And it's about the transitions that we think we need to make in this context of geopolitics and global change. And one is the energy transition, which Helen's already raised. But there are also the questions that we're now becoming concerned about manufacture of chips, the issues that we saw about supply chain bottlenecks in pharmaceuticals with the vaccines and so on. So I think the question, and maybe start with you, Andy, and then work down the line, is how to think about what governments should be doing facing these very large challenges in a complex geopolitical environment. So not a small question.
And I didn't have a lot of time to do my homework, but I will try and answer. I think what Helen said is absolutely right. I mean, the geopolitics of the last, well, going back to the financial crisis, but accelerating kind of through COVID and the war in Ukraine, have kind of forced some of those kind of economic kind of principles and those political responses together in ways that kind of people didn't foresee. So, history didn't end. Liberal markets weren't going to be the way that kind of the world was going to trade with each other, and there would be all sorts of great political consequences and benefits to that. And so what you've got is a load of governments now saying, well, we need to be more resilient. We need to be able to control not just the energy markets, but kind of the supply of medical and pharmaceutical goods and security, kind of manufacturing, defence manufacturing, and that kind of stuff. So you've got kind of governments now sort of saying, well, okay, what is it that we can do to make that more secure, and how can that help us to weather these geopolitical shocks that we're being hit by. So whether it's kind of Biden in the US or Macron talking about strategic autonomy or the UK talking about kind of greater resilience in energy, that's the game kind of politicians are in, and it's right for them to be in that, I think, because those shocks are so significant. And I think it's right for Biden and the US to sort of think, well, okay, where can we bring some of those supply chains closer to home, if not completely to home, so that we've got a kind of a greater pragmatic kind of response to some of this, to some of the changes in China and kind of and Russia in terms of their supply and control of various things, and the UK is kind of wishing the world was different, and of course it isn't, but wishing and kind of thinking that it should be, and saying that we're not really comfortable with wanting to kind of think and act in that way, and we're certainly not going to act at the scale that some of those other places are doing, but we're still going to talk in that language. We're going to talk about energy security. We're going to talk about kind of key sectors and key technologies. And the great article, well, not so great article that Jeremy Hunt wrote in the Times a couple of weeks ago, where he said we're not going to go toe to toe with Biden on the Inflation Reduction Act, because that's it's nonsensical. It's not the way global markets work, and we shouldn't be doing that. And then he proceeded to list all the things that the government was supporting in key technologies and sectors. So in a sense, there's just that kind of that great contradiction that we're doing it, but we wish that the world was behaving in a different way. And it isn't. And there are good reasons why it isn't. And I think kind of the more kind of governments, and particularly our government, realises that and kind of accepts that that other governments are working in that way, understands the reasons why they're the drivers of working in that way, and kind of thinks, okay, well, what is it that we can do in this relatively small country just off the coast of Europe to achieve some of those same things? How can we be more resilient in the face of these shocks? And I think I think we haven't got there yet by any stretch of the imagination, and I'm not sure our political kind of discourse has got there yet, but I think that's where we are.
Would you agree, Helen?
In part. I mean, I don't think it's possible for any European country to be anything like as resilient as the United States to the shocks that are now in play. So I think that one of the real question for European governments in dealing with the Inflation Reduction Act isn't can we do the same, because I'm pretty sure the answer to that is no, is what do we do in a world in which this is what the Americans are doing, and that they are doing it in response to what the Chinese are doing. So if this is a competition between the US and China to dominate the supply chains that are most important to the future, particularly the energy future, what do you do if you're not the US or China? And what do you particularly do if you're a European country like we are, and on this we have this in common with pretty much largely every European country except Norway perhaps still, is when you've got to deal with this new world when you've still got a foreign fossil fuel energy dependency, and when the Americans are basically effectively ripping up the multilateral trading order via the Inflation Reduction Act that has allowed European countries for the last 60, 70 years to deal with their foreign energy dependency problem. The Germans probably most successfully in putting the emphasis they did on export-led growth. And I think they did that very knowingly, knowing that that is the way in which you deal with having to pay for basically having to pay for energy imports. So I think that in some sense the question becomes, well, is it possible for us to do something at lesser scale than the Americans, whilst at the same time integrating ourselves into their supply chains that they want to create? What does that mean for whether we need to try to have a free trade agreement with the United States or not? But that's obviously politically very, very tricky thing to do. I think that on the energy transition itself, that all governments have got to commit at scale to finance technological innovation, because the energy transition depends on it. I mean, it simply isn't possible to get to net zero at all, let alone by 2050, without technological breakthroughs, not least where the storage of electricity is concerned. So I think here they have to be bold, ambitious, imaginative, and be willing to take risks, including tolerating failure, because that is what they've already committed themselves to. They might not want to admit it, but that is what it means to try to achieve net zero. So there's simply no choice here.
Vicky,
My final thing would be that they need to try and think about everything at the same time, because I don't entirely buy the polycrisis narrative, or at least I think there's some limitations to it. But that term captures something in which a lot of different difficult things are happening simultaneously and interactively, and we have to be better at trying to think about them together.
Vicky, do you see bold, ambitious, tolerance of failure on the horizon from the government?
Well, if you're asking me about the UK, no. I don't see anything bold happening here. But it's interesting when you look at what's happening in the US, that the green lobbies have been quite in favour of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, because they think that it's going to be technology that's going to do it, those who do really believe in the technology aspect of it. And given the amount of money that is likely to be spent by the US in this area, then perhaps that will give us a solution which can be copied by everyone else. What happens in the meantime, of course, in relation to the relative economic performance of different regions is a big question mark, which we need to deal with. The truth is that the EU has developed its own. Yes, it's lobbying the US to ensure that they have an inroad into that, but it's also now working a lot more across countries, something that the EU wasn't doing at all before. And we've seen this already with the money that has been spent through COVID and the new generation, the employment, the new generation fund that's been set up, and also this new, which I can't remember the exact name of it, which is the equivalent of the IRA, but in a smaller scale for the moment, but I think it can become considerably bigger. And what I think is quite positive is that there has been some flexibility there in response to this geopolitical threat, if you like, in response to what's going on in the US in particular with what is perceived to be perhaps blocking access by European firms to what is going on in the US. Now, the WTO perhaps should be intervening at some point. But in the meantime, what we've seen in the EU is incredibly interesting. We've seen the abandonment of the Stability and Growth Pact for the time being, which has constrained the fiscal spending that was taking place in those countries. So in other words, it has allowed government to become more involved in each of the countries, and has also finally led to sharing much more of the risk for whatever happens in Europe, which was not the case before in terms of raising funds collectively and Germans and others sharing those risks. And I think there is an increasing flexibility, and I think that's good news. And the fact that at least there is some movement on the Northern Ireland Protocol, which might allow us to get closer to Europe again, is a good thing. But in the meantime, I think it's interesting to look at Germany, that you mentioned. I don't know whether your question was specifically about the UK. I don't think the UK can do anything, frankly, by itself. It will have to spend huge amounts of money that we don't have. And I think, as Helen was saying earlier, it's now much more expensive to do that, even for the government, although interest rates will be coming down at some point. So Germany, that you mentioned, in rather positive terms before, I mean, the truth is it hadn't spent anything on infrastructure, and it relied on the markets. Yes, potholes perhaps aren't there, but apart from that, nothing very much during the Merkel regime, as we know. And of course, the reliance on the market mechanism working and all the gas coming from Russia. But what they've shown is huge flexibility since. You mentioned LNG. So they are now developing those platforms, finally, in order to be able to get that liquefied natural gas in. And they are extending the life of their nuclear power plants, so they're changing that too. They have reduced their use of energy already by something like 20%. Bad news for the economy up to a point. But there is this restructuring that is happening. And I was quite surprised that Europe has reacted really quite quickly to this and is accepting the fact that we're going to be having, although the occasional German murmur comes back nevertheless, that they have accepted the fact that we're now in a position of just having almost permanently higher debt to GDP ratios and without strict sort of punishment if you are above the mantra that we had before, the sort of 60%. So I'm quite hopeful that some push will be made to meet some of those concerns that we all have about energy in particular, but also how the new industrial framework might develop over the next few decades to get to our 2050 period, with a lot of emphasis on technology. I think without that, we'll get nowhere. So in many ways, the amount of money committed already internationally gives me a little bit of reason to be hopeful, but it also means, going back to the original question, that the public sector has to be and will be very substantially involved in this, with money, with regulations, with incentives, with nudging, possibly also with picking winners, really, in a way, and picking industrial champions, which, strangely enough, the EU has been talking about for quite some time, even before COVID.
It's wonderful what a crisis can do. My favourite supply chain story recently was during the pandemic when BioNTech needed to put its new vaccine into vials. The only European company manufacturing the right kind of vials was in Northern Ireland. So they had to ship bioactive materials from Germany to Northern Ireland at a time when we couldn't get sausages across the Irish Sea. So it can be done. So I'm now going to turn to the audience, and I'll do that usual thing of taking 3 comments or questions and then coming back to the panel to see if anybody wants to pick them up. So I've got one hand in the front here, and I'm going to try to maximise the amount to which I make our microphone people run. But we'll start here. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you all 3 of the panel for fascinating, very high-level talk of geopolitics. I'm just going to take it down to a more local level, and for the benefit of you all, I'll make a declaration. I am a politician. And Andy, I'm particularly grateful for your talk, particularly in the University of Manchester, because I am a local politician like another Andy, the Andy Burnham. I'm the mayor for the Combined Authority for Cambridge and Peterborough. My question is very simple. You probably mentioned it most. You did talk about levelling up. And as I say, I don't want to go down high-level economics, but could we be improving the productivity of the United Kingdom simply by involving more of the state? And as a Labour politician, that's maybe no surprise, I'm pro-involvement of the state, but actually the devolved state. We're looking at now the opportunities. It does seem to be Andy Burnham or Andy Street in West Midlands. They are now undertaking trailblazer options, and it does appear to be the go-to answer to maybe improve productivity for all political parties. Do you believe that is the case, and could that solve the problem? I believe it will.
Thank you. Behind you, Tola, there's one right there.
Thanks very. Is that working? Yes, thank you very much. Demetrius Angelis of the Bennett Institute. I was wondering whether people had any thoughts on whether the conventional wisdom on fiscal space, that is the room for manoeuvre for governments to directly borrow and spend at a time of high public debt, might be changing quite radically. People may not have noticed, but with inflation rising as fast as it has, debt to GDP ratios across the world are collapsing. They've fallen about 20% since the pandemic peak in the US. They've fallen 7% in Italy this year, debt to GDP in Italy, just in 1 year. Inflation is eroding away public sector debt. In fact, that liability has now been shifted to the holders of government bonds, and we're seeing what that's doing to the banking sector. But that, combined with the fact that real interest rates remain negative, and probably will remain negative for some time, actually affords quite a lot of scope, potentially, for the public sector to borrow to invest. And I suspect that realization will eventually begin to dawn. And I wonder whether that's potentially the next, we're all looking at last year's problem, but I wonder whether there's going to be a sea change in both the willingness to impose direct public sector strategies in guiding economic policy, but also the fiscal space to do so.
Thank you, Dimitri. And there's one right there by you, Chidim. Thank you.
Thank you. Richard Harris from the Institute for Community Studies. We're sitting in Churchill College, and as Peter Bennett indicated in his opening comments, Churchill was a man of a storied history, but obviously a politician of vision. And from what you've been talking about on the panel so far, that's what we need, because, of course, countries get the politicians that they deserve. We had the Chancellor of the Exchequer and Second Lord of the Treasury in his budget statement announcing a potholes fund, as did his predecessor and his predecessor before that. Where are the nascent political giants on both the left and the right that we can get behind? Perhaps it was the first questioner.
Audience collapses into laughter at that one. Okay, so Andy, the first one was directed at you about local decision making, but obviously others come in on that too.
Yeah, well, a great question, and obviously I believe wholeheartedly in the kind of devolution model. I think the interesting thing, well, a couple of interesting things to say about that. Firstly, in England, there is some consensus for once, not just over devolution being important, and it's kind of quite hard in any discussion about productivity and economic growth not to think about the inequalities and the extent of those inequalities in the UK as a problem for our public finances, for the performance of the economy, and all of those issues. I think it is heartening that both, for once, and it is a rare moment, that both Labour and the Conservatives have some agreement, not just that devolution is important, but the institutions that kind of will deliver that and build on it, that there's some consensus over what they're going to be, and that is the combined authority, and that is kind of, the election of mayors and a devolution framework that, even though kind of, nationally Labour says is very different and more radical, actually they're talking about lots of similar powers, skills, housing, transport. But that consensus, I think, is great. We can almost look forward to the next decade and say there might be some stability there, when if we look backwards, there's very little. So that, I think, is really, really important. I think it's also important because, and this goes back to the geopolitics, weirdly, and that's because the kind of shocks that we've delivered to the world, Brexit, and in the US, kind of Trump, have been pretty big shocks. And I think devolution and addressing economic development, jobs, growth, productivity, particularly in England, in places like kind of the Midlands and the North, or in the US, in the Rust Belt, in kind of, the Michigans, the kind of Ohios of this world, is a way of addressing that. We're trying to build stability into our own democracies, as well as tackle some of the instabilities in the world's kind of economic systems and institutions. So I think it looks both ways, and I think again this is what kind of Biden's trying to do with not just the Inflation Reduction Act, but things like chips and science and big R&D investment in places, which I think talks a little, to your point, Helen, about you got to spend a lot of money on that kind of stuff in order to sort of respond to the challenges that the world presents us with. But I think that kind of going local and thinking about kind of what you do to rebuild those places is actually an answer to the geopolitics, as well as a way of kind of building more growth and productivity into kind of into those regions and into kind of England and the UK as a whole. So I think kind of it's a win-win.
Helen, there's local politics, there's can we just borrow more, and do we need politicians of vision, and if so, where on earth are they?
Yeah, I just make one quick remark on what you've just been talking about, Andy. I do think actually that in its cack-handed way, Boris Johnson's government was trying to do the same thing as what Biden's ended up doing. In some sense, you might say it was the precursor of it, which was essentially to say, because he liked this language, I don't like it, but I'm going to use it because he did, green growth and levelling up go together. And then you basically use the energy transition to try to recreate manufacturing jobs in parts of the country where they have been lost. That it was, in that sense, a reshoring project. But I think you can see that it's actually much more difficult, much more difficult in the UK than it is in the US, in good part for these geopolitical reasons. But I think we can also see, and you can see this actually in Scotland, where some version of this, I'd say, has been long part of the SNP agenda, which is to use offshore wind for jobs generation, is that so far the energy transition hasn't been that good at delivering lots of jobs. It certainly hasn't met anything like the hopes that people have invested in it over the last 20 years in this respect. So Scotland does very well out of offshore wind, but it hasn't led to a manufacturing job renaissance in Scotland in the way in which people hoped. I think on the debt question, it is significant, and I think that if you went back to the middle of the 2010s, so about, let's say like 2015-ish in particular, central banks would have loved a bit of inflation I suggest that that's partly what they were trying to do with their monetary policy in the middle of the 2010s, to get some inflation into the system in order to reduce the value of the debt and then create a bit more fiscal space and try and get the balance of macroeconomic policy away from monetary side onto the fiscal side. And in a way, some version of that is what happened in the pandemic. But my buts would be that I think that it cannot be taken for granted at all that the inflation problem is going away, because I think that it is a bit baked in to the fossil fuel energy regime as things stand at the moment. And indeed, I would suggest at that moment when they were desperate for inflation in 2015, the reason they didn't get it was actually because the Saudis had just crashed the oil price. And so oil causes problems when it crashes, as well as it causes monetary problems, as well as when the price is going up. And when you then add in that it's the Fed that really decides for the rest of the world what monetary policy is going to be, and the fact that in the United States, the inflationary pressure hasn't just come from energy, it's come from wages, it's come from the stimulus that was used to get the Americans through the American households through the pandemic. I don't think there's any clear evidence that the Fed has now got interest rates confidently on in a year's time they're going to be significantly lower trajectory. And I don't think it can, because the oil price problem hasn't gone away. And what we live in now, in a way which wasn't true in 2019, I would suggest, so the year before the pandemic, is one in which OPEC Plus is really setting what the price of oil is. American shale producers can no longer compensate for the difficulties elsewhere in the ways in which they could in the 2010. So if you take that a moment in 2015, why were the Saudis crashing the oil price? They were trying to bankrupt the shale oil producers. It didn't work out for them. But their response to that, their failure to bankrupt the shale oil producers, was to strike a cartel agreement with Russia, OPEC Plus, that has held together through this war and has just now, in the last few weeks, announced another production cut. So I think that there is a structural bias in the oil regime in particular, oil energy regime, still to produce some inflation. And I'm not convinced that the central banks have said we can tolerate that much higher inflation. I think they'll tolerate 3%, maybe even 4%. But once it runs into the levels that we saw during last year, I think they're going to be back onto interest rates going as high as the financial markets will tolerate.
Vicky?
Well, it's interesting. Like households, of course, if you have more inflation and you've borrowed a lot, but you continue, of course, to get paid, and your pay goes up as well, then your debt sort of gets eaten away. But that balance is quite an important one. But there is no doubt that inflation is helping reduce the debt burden. But what you need for sustaining it, especially if inflation then stabilizes, I mean, after all, we have forecasts now of inflation going back down to 2%, in some cases even deflation, because the world growth figures are not particularly great. So yes, perhaps we will see oil prices staying reasonably high because of what OPEC does. So far, their announcement has had very little impact on oil prices, which are really back to where they were sort of 2 years ago. So the low bit of 2 years ago. So you could for a while enjoy the fact that things are slightly better in terms of how you calculate your debt to GDP ratio, and maybe interest rates will come down and it will also be cheaper, as it was for a while before, to borrow. But what you really need to reduce your debt to GDP ratio in a sustainable way is high growth. This high growth is just not anticipated to take place in the next few years. In fact, if you look at the latest IMF forecast, they're pretty pessimistic, and if you look at the UK, even more so. So there is a limit. So you need to rely on something else to be able to get the amount of money to invest in this, and it does actually, up to a point, depend on what the private sector does and what sort of incentives you give to it. Going back to the discussions we were having at the beginning of this session. Are there circumstances right for that? Can you give them enough certainty for this? Are you going to put the money? I mean, of course, you have to take risks, and some of the money that perhaps you're encouraging to be spent to support various bits of this technology revolution we want may just not materialize. And interestingly enough, we were discussing earlier, yes, we're telling you everything that we discussed in the green room now, which was about driverless cars. And I refer to them as, when we were looking at this in our first innovation strategy for the government, as the bit that may fall under the useless innovation. So a lot of money being spent doing things that perhaps you don't need to be doing, and perhaps you should focus on something else. So there is a lot of decision making to be made in this. So, but a lot of that decision making from government has to do with regional policy, which was the question that was raised before. And again, one has lived through the period of abolishing the RDAs. Before that, they were there. We're thinking also about the development agency, whether it was the Welsh Development Agency, it was called, the Scottish, all doing their own trading stuff, of course, and having their offices everywhere you went to internationally. And some of the regional authorities were doing, the development agencies were doing the same as well, to attract investment into those regions, where for some reason we abolished them. But the interesting thing at the time was, how did you calculate? Of course, Treasury and us were all working on that framework to make sure the amount was properly used. A lot of that, of course, was then cut. There was no money for a long period of time really going, and the LEPs didn't really do anything very much in terms of support from the government in terms of funding. So we went backwards in that respect. But still, if you were looking to let those agencies or any devolved government to make decisions about, cost benefit, which is the best way to actually spend our money. At the time, I have to say, the only one that had an economics discipline, if you like, and a bit in it that did the right thing, was the East of England one, which the others didn't. So we had to actually be the economists for all those regions as well. And frankly, if you're looking at the economy as a whole and productivity, there is no doubt that London, I'm afraid, still remains, and the East and Southeast, the most productive bits of the UK, and they redistribute their money elsewhere. It is also, unfortunately, the issue that since COVID, the amount of money you need to do to regenerate the rest of the economy is considerably greater. A great study done, and not just COVID, but also Brexit, just published by David Bailey in Birmingham, shows clearly that the brunt of Brexit has fallen on SMEs, manufacturing SMEs. So all these areas around the UK with manufacturing capabilities have suffered quite significantly because of this and will continue to suffer. And this competitive environment, there is just no way they can recover just like that, even if you start redirecting some money to the region. So something much more needs to be done in terms of ensuring that those regions are able to just recover, let alone expand the way that they want them to. So, obviously any ideas in the trading stuff is good, but it's not going to be easy, is really all I'm saying. And thinking about, what type of people you want to run an innovative and inspiring country, I haven't got a clue. But it hasn't proved to be particularly easy in this environment. And the IMF focus that I mentioned show that really, that we are not getting there somehow.
We've got time for another round of questions. Hands up. Oh, there are more hands up. So one there, please, Tola. And then I'll come to the other side. Thank you.
Hi. Hi. We've talked quite a lot about, governments and business, but a lot of this stuff that's happening is happening to people, and all the time they feel like things are happening to them rather than with them. And I wonder what role education innovation could play in this, in how we can make people a part of these changes and a part of the policy that's getting made to them, and what role the state, business, but also education institutions have in that.
Thank you. Over here.
Good morning. Ian Brotherston from Innovate UK, part of UKRI. I wanted to talk about the picking winners piece in particular and how government can take that forward. Now, UKRI delivered Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. Arguably, that was picking winners, but some would say that was also spread betting because we ended up with 20 challenges. But some of those challenges have actually had some fantastic results. I think of some of the work around small modular reactors, and you talk to people in that part of the world, the UK government has invested hundreds of millions in the research, yet we're now not prepared to procure a small modular reactor and actually build it, improve and build the supply chain through that. So taking that forward, and Diane's heard me speak about this before, what do you think the role of government's procurement can be in stimulating particularly research and innovation, and equally in some respects more intelligent spend via procurement, because we have a huge procurement budget in the UK?
Thank you. I think I might take two more because we're getting on in time. So over here, thank you.
Hello, Simon Shretter, Professor of History and Public Policy here at Cambridge. I was just wondering whether the panel had views on, we haven't really mentioned geopolitical security problems, the war in Ukraine, tensions, serious tensions over Taiwan, whether these considerations might be pushing the world's democratic blocs, USA and EU in particular, actually towards each other more significantly than than has been considered so far in the discussion.
Thank you. And let me do one more. So here at the front, please. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you. Ruby Davis, a member of Wesley House. I just wanted to go back to that comment about, not so much whether there's government presence or the state presence, but the level of involvement or how active government should be. And, it makes me wonder whether we should pay a little more attention to the factors that might push government presence a little more in different circumstances. And if we were to kind of extend this conversation a little broader than the United Kingdom or even Europe, increasingly it seems like the level of instability, political instability, civil unrest, and so on, is pushing government presence more into policy making and into economic policies. And the more that we see state presence, the more that private sector, local folks are pushed out of policy making, and the more that we see more interstate involvement, multilateral agreement, bilateral agreement taking over the space. So, at the moment, we're seeing a number of developing countries in debt and continuously going to the IMF for more loans, being in more debt. And these are not decisions that involve, if you will, all sectors of their economies. But the point is that it is reducing even the private sector's presence, and as you said before, depending on what role you give to the private sector, but increasingly the private sector in many of these countries are being excluded from this, and it's a lot of state presence. But, I mean, in all fairness, the level of instability in these countries are prompting state presence, and I wonder if we should sort of look at the circumstances that cause that to happen, encourage that to happen, whether for good or for evil. Thanks.
Thanks very much. So we've got 4 minutes left before I get into trouble. So you've each got 4 minutes divided by 3 to respond to a really wide range of questions. So I'd suggest that you pick up 1 or 2 points each and leave us with any parting thoughts. But maybe we'll go down the line that way. So Vicky, go ahead.
Okay, perhaps only because I remember it more easily. I start with the last one first. I mean, there is an argument, of course, that loads and loads of developing countries in particular are having issues right now with their debt. There's no doubt about that because of COVID and the energy crisis. And they are discussing right now, with the IMF is discussing at its meeting this week, what to do about them in terms of needing to restructure debt. And of course, there's the issue of China and the extent to which China has already been involved quite significantly with many of them, particularly on the infrastructure side with loans, which they're not restructuring the way that we'd like them to, and all that sort of stuff. But you could argue that this instability that you're referring to also could come from the fact that the state has been too powerful and people are protesting against that. Whichever way around it is pretty bad for the private sector, because there is just no certainty about being able to, unless you are close to the centralized authorities with possibly corrupt practices or whatever, and benefit from that yourself. So it just gives it to just a very small part of the population. What you do find, if you look particularly at inequality of pay, and you find that quite a lot of, yes, of course, you have quite a lot of that in the US and elsewhere, and also in the UK, but you have these great big differences in pay in quite a lot of developing countries, which is much more pronounced. And if you look at it, even China and India fall into that category, worse in that respect than a lot of the developed economies, and perhaps it's not very surprising. So that instability could come from either side, and so it's not necessarily that it causes centralization of decision making. Could be that this centralization is the thing that causes that instability to take place. So you've got to be very careful as to the balance between them. So I'll just do that one, because there were 4, and there's only 3 of us.
We'll see what happens next.
Yeah.
Helen.
Quickly on this question at the general level, I think that it's one of the risks in the world economy and geopolitically, actually, that's not being taken sufficiently seriously at the moment, developing country debt. And I think you can see that it's got a structural pattern to it that we've seen before at the end of the 70s and going into the early 80s, which you have a succession of energy shocks, you have monetary tightening from the United States, that you have a rising dollar, though that's been a bit less true the last few months or so, and it causes heavily indebted, poorer countries huge problems, as we saw through the 80s. And then it involves the international financial organisations in those countries' politics in ways that then itself becomes destabilising. So I think it's really important that you said that, and it should be on everybody's radar about what the risks are that we're dealing with at the moment. On the geopolitics of the United States and Europe in relation to China and Russia, I'm a little bit sceptical of the idea that you can frame what's going on in a democracy versus autocracy narrative. I'm not saying that's necessarily the way that you were putting it, but that's certainly obviously a way in which the Biden administration in particular has been keen at times to frame what's going on both in relation to Ukraine and in relation to Taiwan. I think you can make an argument that says, look, that there's been more unity within the European Union minus Hungary, more unity within NATO minus Hungary, again with some complications around Turkey, than we could have expected in response to Russia's war. But I think you can just as well tell a story that says there's actually been an acceleration of the divergence between the United States and Europe that I think began at the latter part of the 2000s, as the decade of that, I mean, by that. And that we can see that in both in the fact of Europe has experienced a gas shock that has just not happened in the United States. The United States is not having to reinvent how it trades gas or the transit for gas internally within the United States, and doesn't import it from abroad. This is what European countries are having to do, and they're having to compete, particularly on liquid natural gas, with Asian countries. Now, some of that, the fact they did quite well in that competition in 2022, is why Pakistan, or part of the reason why Pakistan is in the difficulty that it is in, because it basically, European countries shut Pakistan out of the market. And while all this has been going on, the US Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which is experienced in European capitals as a very disruptive shock. Now, I agree with Vicky, you can see attempts to respond to it, but I don't think one should underestimate still the amount of anger that's still felt about it, and I don't think one should think that that anger has got nothing to do with the kind of remarks that Macron made on his way back from China. Either it was beginning of this week or last week, I've lost track now. You have essentially what I would see as a war that has really humiliated the idea of strategic autonomy for Europe, certainly in any military capacity. It's the United States that calls the shots about how NATO is going to assess the risks of escalation in this war. It's the United States that will, in the end, decide what kind of terms Ukraine has to settle for. And yet, at this moment of crisis, Macron is still mouthing his platitudes about strategic autonomy without a clear idea of how to get there. And I think it's because it's an expression of the despair that is felt in European countries about just how different now the situation in the United States is from where any of us are in Europe. And Macron's not wrong when he says that Europe's got to adjust to this Sino-American rivalry, but he hasn't got any idea how to do it. And so when he says the things he does, he's just expressing, I think, his frustration.
Andy, final word.
Oh gosh. Well, let me try and draw the first and fourth questions together a bit, and return to the kind of importance of places and institutions. And as you know, Diane, I'm partly responsible for the institutions and governance theme at the Productivity Institute, so this is something that I'm particularly interested in. And I think taking the first question, what are the kind of areas of innovation for education and kind of in terms of local institutions that might matter, and the fourth one about how do you kind of make sure that that's happening appropriately, particularly in developing countries. I think the key is in institutional building, and it's one of the things we often underestimate, and I think particularly currently in England, is how important it is to build capacity in local institutions. Let's have some consensus about what those institutions are, which I think we're getting to, but let's really be honest about how important it is to build capacity into those institutions so that they can discharge those functions. And that includes working with education institutions appropriately. So, the relationship between the East of England as a governance kind of unit and Cambridge University is a kind of key way of trying to address that. But I think I think the importance of doing that will allow us to slowly rebuild some of the things that are broken, whether that's in our politics or whether that's in our kind of weak areas of kind of local economies. And I think step by step, and financially perhaps it has to be step by step, that takes you somewhere. And it takes you to a place where you can allow those kind of local places to sort of not just innovate, but to kind of build capacity and to discharge greater functions of the state at that level, which takes us back to the sort of, how active is the state going to be, well, it's going to be more active, but that's going to include at that level. And I think kind of for us in England and the UK to a slightly different extent, you know, that's one of the key challenges for us really going forward is responding to these things from different levels of government and from different kind of places, and with an eye on kind of the health of those local institutions and the health of those local democracies and economies. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of your point, Vicky, where you said kind of, you know, you were running the economics for all the regions. Well, let's get to a place where the regions can run the economics appropriately through those kind of stronger relationships and institutions.
Well, we've ranged incredibly widely. There's a lot more to discuss over the break, which I've eaten into by 5 minutes, so I apologise for bad timekeeping. We'll keep you very well refreshed during the day. The team will get you back here on time. So please could I ask you to join me in thanking the panel for getting us a great start.